So while I'm waiting for the online questions to come forward and for the other speakers to join us, could I start with you, Russell? Sources for minority groups can be quite tricky. I wonder what you can tell us about the sources you're able to work on.
In some way, yes and no, I'd say to that. In some ways, it's very easy. You just have to know who to ask. But in other ways, of course, because of various things that have happened over time, the records are either not there, difficult to acquire, or nobody knows who has them. So part of that is solving that little puzzle.
Yes. Yes, and so you're finding plenty of material to inform your work.
There is. Yeah, it's not been whilst it hasn't been a great year for some things, there's been an opportunity in this, in that there has been considerably increased interest in what has been going on with Black British history. So more sources are coming out of
emerging now.
Yeah.
Yes, that's excellent. So questions from the audience?
Question for Stuart. You framed your presentation in terms of 1945 to 52. I wondered, was there any change in policy or practice in 1952 which made you choose that year? And also, if I may add, was there during the 45 to 52 period any kind of comparable body in Germany concerned with the same issues, either in that time frame or subsequently? Thank you.
If you mean German organisations, not really, no. German recovery efforts were very much based on clearing the wreckage of their own country and really going out looking for personnel. Certainly didn't happen in the East until after the wall had come down. In the 1990s, they started going into Russia. And there's vast work being done there now. And then I think that was on this side of Germany, I think West Germany, Commonwealth War Graves Commission and similar bodies took care of German casualties for them. 1952 is the endpoint that took, because that's when the MRES was finally wound up. In fact, it had already officially been disbanded a couple of years before and turned into the Missing Research Graves Service, whose job was to, once they'd found and identified tens of thousands of personnel, was to concentrate them into the big cemeteries. But they were still carrying out search and identification work up until 1952.
Thank you. I've got a question here for Sally. This comes from Mark Parry. Sally, how did the proportion of WRAF to male RAF compare to other services in total and on active compared with overseas deployment?
Well, today it's about 10%, I believe, the split. It was actually larger during the Second World War and post Second World War, but as far as deployments overseas were concerned, it was a smaller number of females. But I'd need to look at the books for the exact figures for you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you very much, Sally. And a question here for Stuart. Did the work of the MRES have any effect on the Army's policy regarding such work?
Doesn't seem to have done particularly. And the Army had their own Graves service, but it's just a very different challenge they faced. Obviously, Army battlefields are generally quite well defined, and so it's just a case of clearing that ground. They're not having to go out searching over vast areas, so they didn't need to adapt so much. You get little niche units, like there was an SAS unit set up to trace their casualties who went off and operated in a much more, I suppose, freelance would be the word, basis. But generally the Army, it's just a different nature of a problem, so it didn't have that much effect on them.
Thank you.
Well, thank you to everybody in that panel, and Stuart, if nothing else, this is a great source for a novel. I'm thinking about that blurring between espionage and recovering bodies, so if you have a sideline on that, maybe you can pursue it. I actually have a question for Russell, which is, what about the international context of this, particularly thinking about Pan-Africanism? And, it's interesting that Padmore actually sort of has a career that transcends metropolitan Britain, the West Indies, and eventually Africa. And I'm wondering about how far there is a sort of sense in which, as these former service people start moving around in this post-war world, that they actually sort of start tapping into the sort of broader movements for colonial freedom, and obviously maybe also the African-American freedom struggle too, because I mean, obviously, this is a moment. If we think about our theme here of the world transformed, one of the most things that's quite clear is that the game is pretty much up for empire, or at least there's a growing sense of self-confidence when there's people who want to question empire in this period. So I'm wondering about how far any of your former RAF personnel from the West Indies actually got involved in that sort of international campaign for black rights.
So the answer to that is 100% and lots. I had no time there to get into just Ulrich Cross alone. Well, put it this way: there was a film released covering his life. It's called Hero. The life and based on the life and extraordinary times of Mr. Ulrich Cross. And I can tell you that despite all that despite all his decorations and achievements within the RAF, the time spent on his RAF in an action sequence in that film was approximately 3 minutes for an hour and a half film. That it just gives you some kind of idea of how much this man achieved in his life. And this is one person I'm talking about here. There were theories in that film on the potential for a United States of Africa, which he was around with all his law of his law work at the time. Present, or at least nearby for the assassination of President Lumumba. There's a whole story to get into with MI6 in particular. Google Daphne Park when you've got 5 minutes. Find one of her deathbed confessions quite interesting there. Regarding the US, I didn't get into that at all here because that's a completely separate talk on its own. In fact, even talking about the time that the relations with African American GIs, white American GIs, and their interaction with the Brits, I could go on a good hour about that. There's a Burgess Meredith video that was made for reasons of how to behave as an American GI in the UK, and I can tell you that was aimed at the white American GIs firmly. Yeah. To answer that is that alone is a deep rabbit hole in which to go, just because, of course, the attitudes towards segregation. There was a school of thought amongst some white GIs that they could carry that over here and expect it to happen. And this was the thing that managed to make a lot of the British public go, "Oh no, we're not doing that over here," and they actively resisted. Obviously, the black soldiers got stuck in as well. But again, differences with what was happening with Jamaican soldiers and West Indian soldiers, sorry, and the American soldiers. Alan Wilmot and Baron Baker both have stories on that, and they're quite interesting as well.
Thank you for that. A question now from our online audience, and this question is for Clive. Clive, has the RAF been successful in learning from its history, as well as achieving its aspiration of preparing for the next war in its conduct of air operations since 1945?
Well, I think in terms of operations, I think that the trend post 1945 was to to actually concentrate on a nuclear environment. And from that perspective, certainly operations in Northwest Europe owed increasingly little to wartime history or indeed doctrine. The emphasis was very much on nuclear weapons delivery and indeed the defence of the UK in terms of that. I think arguably from 1989 onwards, as the Air Force has taken on a more expeditionary nature, then there has been an effort to recover its history, things like the Trenchard Keys Initiative. But certainly in the period that we are talking about today, you see a gradual drift away from history as a guide to operations. It is simply where history wasn't really viewed as relevant. And indeed, as I say, increasingly a drift away from doctrine.
Thank you.
Question for Russell. In 1945, the Air Force, the Air Council, resisted the attempt of the other two services to reimpose the interwar colour bar, which had stated, for those who don't know, that if you were going to join the Royal Air Force, you needed to be of pure European descent, which actually got the Air Ministry into a bit of trouble before the war, because when they were challenged on this this policy, they couldn't actually define, unsurprisingly, what pure European descent actually meant. But in 1945, when the Army and the Navy were proposing to reimpose exactly that policy, the Air Force said, we don't want to do that, and we're not going to do that. But I wondered whether any of, particularly the West Indians who'd served, actually continued to serve after the war. I've not been able to discover myself whether any of them simply continued their service in the way that lots of white aircrew, etc. Obviously, during the war, everybody was enlisted into the RAF Volunteer Reserve. So if you wanted to continue your service post-war, you had to apply to be a regular airman. So I wonder whether, are you aware of any of the West Indians actually trying to do that?
Yes, there were quite a few actually. I think you more or less nailed it there. The RAF were providing a pretty good life for African and West Indian service personnel, to which again everyone I mentioned during that has at some point been asked how they got on and whether they encountered any racism within the service, and they were all extremely positive about it. I mean, you've got there are complications with that. And as I recall, I think some of the RAF brass at the time had a certain degree of resistance. I know Slessor was outspoken at some point and said something uncomplimentary about service personnel possibly being officers, but that's a whole different thing. I think trying to. I think one thing 2020 is telling us very, very well is that old colonial attitudes are not dying easily. So imagine after, like at the beginning, I mentioned a bit that the seeds of potential independence and decolonisation were started even back in were an overhang from the First World War, when people came back and said, look, I've seen, look what I've seen. I think there's something we can do here. But then everybody, as can happen when there are certain movements, there is movement in the other direction, and it tends to be quite regressive. So we had to, I mean, the very colour bar we were talking about, at the time of the First World War, it wasn't lifted. It was hand waved a couple of times. Certainly Walter Toll was one of those, and William Clark was another. There was a bit of a hand wave. Yeah. Then later we had to, and then later, as far as certainly army commissions went, it was another 23 years after Toll before there was another Black Commission, which was about the time, which would have been 39 when the colour bar was officially lifted. But again, it took the Air Ministry a year after that to get it moving.
Thank you. We have time for one last question, please.
This is for Clive and for Russell. Clive, what was the exact position held by John Strachey in the PR organisation of the RAF during World War II? And was there any attempt to portray the RAF as a multiracial force during and after the war? But clearly it was an imperial force in many ways. Was it also multiracial?
Well, I can only answer that question in part. My memory is that John Strachey was... there were a group of writers that were together employed by DPR in PR3. They were dubbed Writer Command, and Strachey was one of those. Alongside the name we've heard today, John Padney and others, Uncle Hedgie Bates famously. And their job was to actually write not just PR material, but more in-depth material. The Air Ministry was very keen to draw on their talent as writers, and was very adept at putting them into uniform. With regards to the question about the multi-ethnicity of the Royal Air Force, my own impression from the research that I've done is that certainly Air Ministry photographers and so forth were keen to capture imagery of the multiracial composition of the Air Force, and DPR was keen to portray that during the Second World War. Post-war, I think there was less emphasis on that. I don't know whether that was to do with policy. I've simply not researched it. But certainly there was an appreciation during the war. It was very much seen as part of the reason why the war was being fought. And so there was a desire to portray the Royal Air Force as a multi-ethnic force, drawn from not just from the UK, but from the wider empire.
So there was a certain order of things with this, because when pretty much the minute the war had been declared and they'd heard in the West Indies through the BBC World Service, there were people who immediately wanted to come and join up. That I can't stress that level of loyalty and duty to what they called the mother country at the time, and they tried to come over. Either weren't getting, either were refused initially, or did manage to come over and were still turned away from the recruiting offices at the time. It was only after, yes, it was. I can't remember the exact timing on this, but certainly with the depletion of pilots and aircrew from the Battle of Britain, there was an increased drive to let the rest of the empire come and fight if they wanted to, and yes, I know West Indian troops were looking to sign up in droves for those very reasons.
back across the
And there was still, and even with the lifts, there were still occasional excuses being made for things, for people not quite managing to get where they wanted. Cy Grant mentioned something about he mentioned something about initially going for pilot training, and he didn't actually. I haven't got the exact quote with me. I got it somewhere, but he got suddenly transferred to navigator training, and he didn't think anything of it at first, but somebody mentioned. But after a little bit of conversation, time looking in the time heading to the fridge and going, wait a minute, or whatever it was, he noticed something was a little off of that. But at the same time, after that, he was absolutely fine.
Good. Well, we must draw a line there, and I'd just like to say thank you to the speakers present in the hall here and our two online contributors. So please show your appreciation once again.
Okay, and before you all disappear from the live stream, I should say we're back again at 9:45 tomorrow, and you can also promote our conference so that we can get above 200, possibly up to 300. So do tweet or Facebook or whatever your particular social media channel is, our event. We're also going to have a Twitter hour from 5 when we will be down the pub. So we'll be live tweeting from the Beaufort pub. So do tune in then. Okay. Thank you again to all of our speakers, particularly to Russell and Sally, who this was their first conference. So well done.